The car went through the guardrail on the Roosevelt Bridge late in the night, and by the time the gurney hit the doors of Street Brendan's Mercy, the young man on it had less than 45 minutes left. Blood pressure 62/40. Skin the color of cold ash. The whole room froze for half a second, the half second that separates those who have been trained from those who have only read about it, and Marin Kessler was already moving before the doors swung shut. Elias Marchetti came in alongside the gurney, snow still clinging to his black coat, two of his men clearing the way ahead of him, and the entire corridor changed rhythm around his footsteps. Security straightened up. The desk clerk stopped typing mid-word. In 10 years, no one had ever told that man where to stand. Marin did not look up. "You're blocking my light. 2 steps to your right." He looked down at the hands holding his brother's life, and he took 2 steps. She named the condition before the ultrasound had finished powering on, slid the needle in at an angle toward the left shoulder, and the number on the monitor stopped falling. 71, 78, 83. Somebody behind her let out a breath they hadn't known they were holding. Then she reached across the head of the gurney for the IV tubing. Her left sleeve slipped back, and there on the inside of her wrist was a small tattoo, a circle broken open at the top, a single straight line running through it. Black ink, rough lines, done by no professional hand. Elias Marchetti forgot where he was standing, because he had seen that mark once before, years earlier, on the wrist of a gray-haired man stitching him closed by the beam of a headlamp, in a room that smelled of oil smoke, with paint peeling off the walls, a room he was never able to find again the next morning. He watched those hands move, and understood something that ran cold down his spine. Those were not the hands of someone trained in a classroom. They were the hands of someone who had done this exact thing in a place with no surgical lights, no instrument cart, and no one at all to call when things went wrong. If this story reaches you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with someone who comes to mind, and subscribe to our channel to hear the rest. The technician came running in from the corridor beside the supply room and managed only a single sentence. There were no units of O-negative blood left. The pileup on the highway that afternoon had emptied the refrigerator in less than 2 hours, and the 3 nearest hospitals in the city were facing the same shortage. Marin listened to the end without asking him to repeat himself, or turning to anyone for confirmation. She picked up the telephone beside the bed and dialed the inter-hospital coordination line directly, bypassing the entire chain of reporting that every nurse in the building knew they were supposed to follow. The person on the other end asked which doctor was calling. She gave her name, her employee identification number, and the patient's condition. Then said that if a physician's signature was required, they could record that she had made the decision on her own authority. In the 7 seconds of silence that followed, she knew she had just placed the nursing license she had held for 7 years on the scale, and she also knew that if she waited another minute to find someone willing to sign in her place, that scale would tip toward the outcome no one wanted. The coordinator said they would call back. She put down the receiver and returned to the work of her own 2 hands. Then the machine changed its voice. It was no longer the broken, intermittent alarm from moments before, but one continuous, flat, unbroken tone, the kind of sound everyone in that profession could recognize even in their sleep. The line on the monitor stretched flat. One of the 2 residents instinctively stepped back half a pace, and that half step said everything about the distance between him and the woman standing on the other side of the bed. Marin had already climbed onto the step stool, one hand over the other, her elbows locked, and begun compressions. She didn't count aloud. The others in the room counted for her, loudly at first, losing the rhythm in their panic, then gradually falling silent when they realized she didn't need their numbers. Her shoulders rose and fell at an unchanging pace, steady enough to be frightening, as though there were a clock inside her chest that no one else could see. During the 4th round, the nurse standing nearest reached out to switch places with her, just as every protocol recommended, because the arms of anyone performing compressions would begin to weaken after 2 minutes. Marin gave one small shake of her head. She didn't step down. She knew something the protocols never wrote down, that every change of hands created a gap, and with the chest beneath her palms at that moment, a gap was the one thing she couldn't allow. The heart rhythm returned on the final compression before she was about to call for medication. The monitor caught one ripple, then another, and then a continuous sequence. The whole room released its breath at once, but Marin didn't. She had placed her palm against the patient's abdomen earlier, almost without thinking, guided by a habit so old that even she couldn't remember where she had learned it, and what she now felt beneath the fabric made her straighten. The abdomen was firmer than it had been the first time she touched it, not by much. Just enough for someone who had laid a hand on hundreds of abdomens in the dark to recognize the difference. She pressed gently once more to be certain, then looked up and said he was bleeding where no one could see it. One of the residents said the scans hadn't shown anything. She replied that the scans had been right then, but they weren't right anymore. Then she called the operating room, called the blood bank for the second time, and called the anesthesiologist on duty. 3 calls made in less time than it took to draw one long breath. Each time, she said exactly what needed to be said, and hung up without wasting a single word. The gurney began to move. Its wheels squealed across the tile. The fluid bag struck against the side rail, and the person squeezing the ventilation bag beside it nearly had to run to keep pace. Elias Marchetti pressed himself against the wall to make room, and as the gurney passed him, he saw his brother's face for the second time that night. The elevator doors opened at the precise moment the wheels reached the threshold, not 1 second early and not 1 second late, because someone had called 3 minutes earlier and asked for it to be held, and that same person was now pushing the gurney. The doors closed. The white light inside the elevator fell across Maren Kessler's face, and Elias saw that it held absolutely no expression at all. Half an hour later, a refrigerated truck, bearing no company name, stopped at the hospital's rear loading dock and delivered 12 units of O-negative blood, accompanied by valid transportation documents, complete down to the last official seal. The hospital director came down in person to sign for the delivery, watched the truck pull away, and didn't ask a single question. The garage occupied the basement of a warehouse building on the west side of the city, and the mechanic had been waiting there for nearly 4 hours before Elias Marchetti walked in. No one had tied him up. No one stood blocking the door. Someone had made him a cup of coffee and left it untouched on the steel table until it went cold, because in that room, kindness always came first, and it always frightened people more than anything else. Elias offered no greeting. He pulled out the chair across from the mechanic, sat down, removed his coat, and draped it over the back. For a long while, he did nothing but study the mechanic's hands resting on the table. Thick hands with oil worked deep into every crease, the kind of hands that 30 years of labor had left beyond the reach of soap and water. Then he opened his briefcase and placed a thin file on the table. The mechanic looked down and recognized the first page immediately, because he had looked at that piece of paper once a month for 11 years. The mortgage on his small house on the south side of the city, the remaining balance, the next due date, the name of the institution that held the debt, a name that sounded perfectly ordinary, perfectly legitimate, and gave anyone on the outside no reason to look twice. Elias didn't turn another page. He tapped one finger against the cover of the file exactly once, then spoke in a voice lower than the hum of the ventilation fan overhead. He said the mechanic would keep that house, as long as he remembered who had decided to let him keep it. Then Elias stood, put on his coat, and walked out. The mechanic remained seated for several more seconds, before slowly rising to his feet, and on his way to the door, he dropped his ring of keys twice. No one bent down to pick them up for him. No one said another word. That was everything that happened in that room, and Hollis Barrow, who had stood in the corner from beginning to end, understood that it would follow the man for the rest of his life. In the hospital parking lot, the snow had stopped falling, and a thin layer of ice covered the pavement, reflecting the glare of the overhead lights. Elias leaned back against the car door, took out his phone, and made the first call. He told the person on the other end that he needed all the camera footage from the Roosevelt Bridge that night, from both directions and from the light poles at both ends of the bridge, and he needed it backed up before the system automatically recorded over it at the end of its 7-day cycle. He didn't explain why. He didn't ask whether it could be done. He simply stated what he needed, waited 2 seconds, then thanked the person and hung up. The second call was much shorter. He dialed a number that wasn't saved in his contacts, waited through the first ring, and when someone answered, he spoke exactly one name before lowering the phone. Hollis stood several paces away with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, thinking that people had always imagined his employer all wrong. They pictured meetings behind closed doors, threats, voices rising in anger. The truth was that Elias Marchetti had never needed to raise his voice to anyone. He simply made telephone calls, and that was what made the entire city fall silent whenever people heard his last name. Hollis watched his white breath drift into the air before him, and let his memory return to 3 weeks earlier, to the morning when a plain envelope, with no name, no return address, and no postmark had appeared on the reception desk at the River North office. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of 1 page from an old medical record, yellowed with age, with faded type in the lower corner, and the handwritten signature of a doctor no one in the office recognized at the bottom. Above that signature was the patient's name, Aldo Marchetti, Elias's father, who had been in the ground for 10 years. There was no message enclosed. No demand for money, no threat, not a single handwritten line, just one page, delivered without explanation, and nothing more. Elias had held that sheet beneath the light of his desk lamp for a very long time, and afterward, he gave it to someone and instructed him to find out where it had come from. That man was Barrett Quinn. The surgery lasted nearly 5 hours, and by the time the operating room doors opened, the sky outside had begun to change from black to the pale gray that only people who worked through the night ever truly knew. The surgeon pulled his mask down beneath his chin and said briefly that they had stopped the bleeding in the liver, that the abdomen had been left open according to damage control protocol and would be closed during a later operation if the patient became stable, that he was still breathing with the help of a ventilator, and that his prognosis could only be described as guarded. When he finished, he walked straight to the changing room without pausing to accept anyone's thanks, because people in that profession understood that gratitude offered too soon was a dangerous habit. The bed was wheeled up to the intensive care unit, where the nurse receiving the handoff was a woman who had been in the profession for more than 20 years, long enough to no longer be surprised by anything. She read the entire report, stopped at the description of the initial treatment, then read it a second time, more slowly. Afterward, she looked up and spoke to the entire hallway, without addressing anyone in particular, saying that whoever had done those things downstairs had clearly done them somewhere else before. She said it as a compliment, but the way she let the sentence trail off, and the way she looked around, waiting, turned it into a question. The 2 residents standing nearby didn't answer. The technician pushing the equipment didn't answer either. And Maren Kessler, standing 6 paces away, signed the final word on the handoff form, clipped her pen into her pocket, and walked toward the stairwell. She didn't look back at the bed even once. It wasn't because she had forgotten it. In the 2 years she had worked in that building, there hadn't been a single patient she had forgotten. It was simply that she had learned a long time ago, in a place where that lesson had come at a terrible price, that revealing whom you cared about was also a way of revealing who you were, and some people couldn't afford to let anyone see who they truly were. At noon that day, when the winter sunlight finally broke through the clouds and fell in pale golden streaks across the floor of the pediatric hallway, a 7-year-old boy named Sammy Hargrove walked past the reception desk with his mother. His left arm was wrapped in a white cast, the result of a fall while learning to ice skate at the public rink near his home, and the plaster was already crowded with the signatures of his classmates. He saw Maren standing at the counter, writing something, let go of his mother's hand, and ran over to her. He dug a green turtle sticker out of his coat pocket and pressed it directly onto the name badge pinned to her chest. He placed it slightly crooked, covering part of the first letter of her last name. His mother stood a few steps away, laughing as she prepared to tell him to apologize. But Maren had already bent down until her eyes were level with his. She studied the sticker with the solemn attention of someone examining a test result, then said that the turtle looked as though it was very good at moving slowly and still reaching the finish line. Sammy burst into laughter, showing the gap where his 2 front teeth were missing, then ran back to take his mother's hand and pulled her onward toward the examination room. Maren straightened. She didn't remove the sticker. It remained there for the rest of that afternoon, and throughout all the days that followed. Elias Marchetti stood in the hallway of the intensive care floor as morning fully arrived, one hand resting on the cold steel railing while he looked through the glass into the room where his brother lay, with tubes and wires running from every part of his body. He thought about the 3 container ports under his name, the 2 transportation companies, and all the people who would answer their phones at any hour when they saw his number appear. And for the first time in his life, he understood with absolute clarity that not one of those things could have bought the last 45 minutes. The wrecked vehicle was towed to a workshop south of the Harbor District, and Hollis Barrow had been there since before dawn, circling it 3 times before laying a hand on anything. By the middle of the afternoon, he called Elias, and when Elias arrived, Hollis didn't waste a single word. He pointed to a small black plastic box buried deep behind the dashboard, something an ordinary person could look past 100 times without noticing, and explained that the vehicle's electronic control module had been tampered with. Not damaged, tampered with. The work was so clean that if the vehicle had fallen into the hands of an ordinary insurance company, a conclusion would have been written within a week, stating that the crash had been caused by a mechanical defect in that particular model, that the manufacturer should consider recalling the batch, and the file would have been closed without a single line mentioning criminal wrongdoing. Hollis said that whoever had done this hadn't wanted to kill noisily. They had wanted a death the entire city would call an accident and forget within 3 days. Then he fell silent for several seconds, took out his phone, opened a photograph of the rear of the vehicle, and showed Elias the license plate. Elias stared at it. He stared for a very long time, far longer than it should have taken to read 7 characters, because it wasn't Milo's vehicle. It was his. The vehicle he drove every evening, along the same route he took every evening, across that same bridge. That night, Milo had stopped by the house and asked to borrow it because his graduation model and blueprints were too large for the small car he normally drove, and because he had never needed to ask his older brother twice for anything. He had loaded the oversized sheets of cardboard onto the back seat and carefully tied them down so they wouldn't fall over. And because of that, he had driven around the curve much more slowly than Elias usually did. Hollis said it in the flattest voice he could manage, that those sheets of cardboard were the only reason Milo was still alive when the vehicle left the bridge. Elias said nothing. He stood there amid the smell of engine oil and the cold metal scent of the workshop, while the entire room waited for him to speak. He didn't. He merely reached his right hand across to his left wrist and turned his father's plain steel watch exactly half a rotation, a gesture whose meaning was known to only 2 people in the organization, and Hollis was one of them. Then Elias spoke in a low, even voice and said he wanted a list, not a list of enemies, not a list of people with motives, simply a list of everyone who had known where he intended to go that night. 4 hours later, a sheet of paper was placed on the table in the River North conference room, and 6 names were written on it. 6, no more and no less. 6 people inside an organization he had spent 10 years building, and every name belonged to someone he had once trusted without needing to think. Everyone seated around the table read the sheet in silence, and while they were reading, Barrett Quinn rose to fetch the coffee pot from the corner of the room. He filled each cup in turn, beginning with the person seated farthest away, exactly as he had done at every meeting for the past 11 years. He poured a cup for Hollis. He poured Elias's last, setting it down gently enough to make no sound, then returned to his seat and lowered his eyes to read the paper just like everyone else. No one looked at him. At that point, no one had any reason to look at him. Late that night, as Elias walked through the parking garage behind the building, a woman stood waiting between 2 rows of concrete pillars. She wore a gray wool coat, her hair was neatly tied back, and she held nothing in her hand except a business card. She didn't block his path. She simply remained there until he stopped, then held out the card and introduced herself as Federal Agent Dara Whitfield. She said she had been reading files bearing his family name for many years, long enough to know that he wouldn't speak to her that day, and long enough to know that what had just happened on the bridge was unlike anything that had come before. Elias didn't reach for the card. He looked at it for the length of a single breath, then walked past her and opened his car door. Behind him, Dara Whitfield's voice rose calmly through the cold air, telling him that he would take it. The time simply hadn't come yet. Hollis Barrow didn't investigate the name Marin Kessler, because a name in the hospital's personnel system would only tell him what someone wanted him to know. He investigated the mark. Throughout the 12 years he had worked beside this family, and the 8 years before that in his former profession, he had held on to a habit he had never been able to break. He photographed everything, not to use it, just to have it. The external hard drive he kept in the bottom drawer of his safe contained tens of thousands of photographs arranged by year, and he sat before the screen from late afternoon until well past midnight, moving through the folders one by one, his eyes beginning to ache, his coffee going cold for the 3rd time. He searched for what he remembered, a circle left open at the top with a straight line cutting across it. Near dawn he stopped. The photograph before him wasn't a picture of someone living. It showed a page from an old scene report, the paper stained with age and photographed hurriedly beneath an office light, with a small image printed in the upper left corner. That image showed the inside of a man's left wrist, and on that wrist was the exact mark Hollis had seen in the emergency room at St. Brendan's Mercy several days earlier. The man had gray hair. He had been pulled from the ruins of an abandoned fire station in West Garfield after a blaze on a winter night 7 years before. Hollis scrolled down to the final line of the report, to the section containing the official cause, where 2 neatly typed words read, "Electrical short." Directly beneath those words, in the box reserved for the investigator responsible for the scene, was a handwritten signature he recognized immediately, because he had written it thousands of times in his life. It was his own. Hollis Barrow sat motionless before the screen for a very long time, his hand still resting on the mouse, and during that time, he could think of only one thing. 7 years earlier, he had taken a pen and signed the paper that closed the case. He had signed it without knowing what he was truly signing, and that same signature had buried the gray-haired man beneath the words "electrical short" for 7 years. The next morning, he brought everything to Elias. He didn't hide his signature or try to soften what he had done. Elias listened to the end, then asked who might know more than the page could tell them. Hollis gave him a name and an address in Cicero. The old man's name was Walter Nye. He had worked as a city fire investigator for more than 30 years before retiring, and he now lived alone on the second floor of an old brick house, with a wooden staircase that creaked at the 4th step. When the door opened a crack and Walter saw the man standing on the landing, he recognized him immediately, and his hand began to push the door closed. Elias didn't hold it open. He didn't climb another step or offer a single word of persuasion. He merely bent down, placed a thin bundle of papers on the concrete landing before Walter, then stepped back exactly 2 paces and stood still. Walter Nye looked down at the papers. He studied them through the narrow opening, then opened the door a little wider and bent to pick them up with both hands. They were a copy of the original scene report from that night, the handwritten version created before it was typed, the document that had been removed from the official file and no longer existed anywhere in the city's system. He had been searching for it for 7 years. He stood there for a long time, his hands trembling slightly, then stepped aside and invited the 2 men in. In the cramped apartment, where boxes of files were stacked all the way to the ceiling, Walter Nye poured coffee into 3 mismatched cups and sat down to listen. He listened to everything without interrupting once, occasionally giving a slight nod, as though confirming to himself something he had believed for years but that no one else had been willing to believe with him. When Hollis finished, Walter set down his cup, opened the papers to the 3rd page, turned it so both men could see, and pointed to 3 pencil circles on the floor plan. He said he had written exactly what he saw, and what he saw were 3 separate points of ignition, far apart from one another, in 3 different corners of the building, all beginning at almost the same moment. Then he repeated the sentence he had spoken to his superior 7 years earlier, the sentence that had earned him an order to go home and retire quietly. An electrical short never begins in 3 places at once. Hollis asked what else he remembered. Walter Nye looked at him, then at Elias, and answered that there was one detail he had recorded in the handwritten report that had never appeared in the typed version. It was the statement of a newspaper delivery man who had passed the building near dawn and said that while the roof was burning, a man had stood motionless across the street watching, both hands in his coat pockets. He hadn't called the fire department. He hadn't run away. He had simply stood there until everything collapsed. Walter finished the last of his coffee, then added that if the 2 of them truly wanted to know who had been standing across the street that night, they should probably begin by asking their own people. The emergency stairwell on the 4th floor of St. Brendan's Mercy was the only place in the building without cameras, announcement speakers, or anyone passing through, unless an alarm had sounded. Maren Kessler sat on the 4th step from the top, her back against the cold concrete wall, an open plastic food container resting on her knees. She ate the only meal of her entire shift in small, slow bites, the way people did when they had grown accustomed to being interrupted at any moment. She heard the metal door below open, and knew who it was before she saw him. Elias Marchetti climbed to the landing and stopped there without taking another step. Beneath the sickly blue glow of the fluorescent light, his black coat looked much older than it did when he wore it outside. He placed a thick envelope on the step between them. It wasn't sealed, and nothing was written on the outside. Then he withdrew his hand and straightened. Maren looked at it. She neither reached for it nor pushed it away. She simply set the lid of her food container beside her and said that he was trying to pay her for something she couldn't have done if she had been willing to accept payment. Elias didn't argue. He didn't pick up the envelope either. Instead, he asked another question in a low, ordinary voice, as though asking for the time. He asked what the mark on her wrist meant. Her hand stopped in midair for the span of a single heartbeat, so briefly that only someone waiting for it would have noticed. Then, she pulled the sleeve of her uniform down over her wrist, with a movement she had repeated too many times in her life to require thought, and told him that some doors couldn't be closed once they had been opened, so it would be better if he didn't knock. Elias nodded once. He remained silent for a long time, long enough for her to think he was about to leave. Then he began to speak, looking not at her but at the wall across from him. He told her that many years ago, when he had been much younger than he was now, he had awakened in a room that smelled of oil smoke, with paint peeling from the walls in wide patches. He had been lying on a table that wasn't an operating table, and a gray-haired man was stitching his wounds beneath the light of a flashlight strapped to his forehead. The man hadn't asked his name. He hadn't asked where Elias had come from, or how he had ended up in that condition. When Elias asked for his name, the man had said only that no one there had a name. Elias said that the next morning, he left a stack of money on the table, and 3 days later, the entire stack was returned to him through the mail without a single word enclosed. When he finished, he fell silent, and the only sound left in the stairwell was the faint hum of the ventilation system. The food container on Maren Kessler's knees slipped. It tipped sideways, spilled everything onto the concrete steps, then rolled down 2 more before coming to rest. She didn't bend to pick it up. She rose very slowly, gripping the iron railing with one hand, and Elias watched her knuckles turn white against the metal. She didn't say another word. She walked down, stepped past the envelope without looking at it, opened the metal door on the 3rd floor, and went straight into the hallway. Elias remained alone on the landing, with the spilled meal at his feet and an envelope no one had taken. That night, when her shift ended, and the only sound in the women's changing room was water dripping from a broken faucet in the far corner, Maren opened her locker. Behind a spare pair of shoes and an old coat, at the very bottom, was a square tin box with one dented corner, the kind people often used for holiday cookies. She placed it on the bench, sat down, and opened the lid. There wasn't much inside. 4 typed petitions, each folded along old creases, and each accompanied by a printed response containing almost the same words, stating that the request for reconsideration had been received and that there were no grounds for reopening the file. 4 different agencies, 4 different years. Beneath the petitions was a photograph printed on ordinary paper, showing the front of a brick building with 2 stories and a large rolling door. The picture had been taken in daylight, when the building was still intact. At the very bottom, beneath even the photograph, lay a sheet of graph paper with worn edges and lines handwritten in blue ballpoint ink, a list that had grown over time in strokes of different shades and weight. Maren read it from the beginning, slowly, as she did every time. When she reached the 9th line, she paused longer than she had at the others. There was only one word there, written in capital letters. Its ink darker than every other line because it had been traced over again and again. Marchetti. She looked at it for a little while longer. Then she folded the paper along its old creases, returned it to the bottom of the box, and closed the lid. The gray-haired man had a name. It took Hollis Barrow 3 days to find it, not by questioning anyone, but by tracing backward from the dental records of the body recovered from the ruins that night, the only evidence that had remained intact enough for comparison. Ezra Lund, born in a small town in the northern part of the state, educated in medicine in Michigan, a general surgeon for 17 years, and then gone from every directory of practicing physicians in the state. Hollis found the reason in the medical board's archives, inside a disciplinary file that had been closed long ago and was strangely thin for the severity of its conclusion. Ezra Lund had been permanently stripped of his medical license for a serious violation of professional standards. But what made Hollis sit upright was buried in the attached pages at the back, pages the person who assembled the file had apparently forgotten to remove. Ezra Lund hadn't been an unknown doctor running a charitable clinic for the poor. For many years before that, he had served as the private physician to a family. He maintained a private practice in an elegant building on a city street, but he spent most of his time working in their home, and the family's name appeared repeatedly among the attached payment records. He had been with them for more than 20 years. He had been present on nights no hospital ever knew about, until one night, when he refused to do something. The file described the matter in dry administrative language, stating that Dr. Lund had refused to complete and sign a death certificate, using the cause supplied by the patient's family, and had instead provided a different account of the cause of death, based on his own direct observations. 2 weeks later, the medical board received 3 separate complaints against him from 3 different sources. 6 weeks after that, he lost his license. Hollis turned to the final page in search of the patient's name from that night, and when he saw it, he didn't call immediately. He printed the entire file, placed it in a folder, drove to the parking lot behind the River North building, and waited there until Elias came down. Elias read it inside the car. He didn't turn on the interior light. He left the door slightly open and read by the overhead light filtering through the snow clinging to the glass. Snow had begun falling again that afternoon and now covered the entire parking lot, and the only sound inside the car was the turning of pages. He read the page bearing the patient's name twice. Aldo Marchetti, his father, the man who had been in the ground for 10 years, whom the entire city believed had died in a violent reckoning between 2 sides fighting for control of the harbor, and upon whose death Elias had built his entire life for the past 10 years. He had taken control of everything at the age of 24, because of that death. He had pursued the people he believed responsible for it, one by one, patiently and without haste, for 10 years. And now, inside a car parked in a field of snow, he was holding the testimony of the only person who had been in the room that night, the man who had seen what happened with his own eyes and had refused to sign the paper, claiming that events had unfolded the way others wanted them recorded. Elias remained that way for a very long time. He didn't strike the steering wheel with his fist. He didn't make a sound. He simply placed the file on the seat beside him and stared through the windshield as it slowly clouded with his own breath, while every face from those 10 years passed through his mind, every name, every decision he had made with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he was right. Hollis stood outside the car, and when Elias lowered the window, he told him the final part, the part he had spent a long time deciding whether to reveal that night. He said he had checked the organization's expense records from the period surrounding the fire, and during that week there had been a payment to a small demolition contractor on the west side of the city, a name no one remembered anymore, for a sum too small to make anyone ask questions. The expense had been approved with the accounting department's customary signature, while the box identifying the person who requested it had been left blank. No name, no note, only a date. And that date corresponded exactly with the week the brick building with 2 stories burned down to its frame. When Hollis finished, he fell silent. Elias continued staring straight ahead. He said that the only person in the world who had preserved the truth about his father's death had died in a fire paid for with his own family's money. He came to pick her up the morning after her shift, parking beside the employee exit, and when she emerged with a canvas bag over her shoulder, he simply opened the car door and said he wanted to take her somewhere. She didn't ask where. Neither of them spoke during the entire drive toward the west side of the city. The snow from the night before had hardened into a solid layer over the sidewalks. The plows had left 2 long black tracks behind them, and the buildings on both sides of the road gradually grew farther apart and lower, until only boarded storefronts and vacant lots enclosed by wire fencing remained. He stopped at a street corner she recognized before he had time to turn off the engine. Maren Kessler sat motionless in the car for a very long time. Across the street stood a brick building with 2 stories, or rather what remained of one, a bare frame rising from the snow, with a large, rusted rolling door and windows covered by plywood that had warped beneath 7 years of rain and sun. On the front wall, beneath the black soot, the old numbers of the fire station could still be read from the days when it had been in service. She opened the car door and crossed the street without waiting for him. Along the side of the building was a place where one of the boards had come loose, and she knew exactly where it was. She reached out and pushed it aside with a movement far too familiar to be her first time. Inside, light entered only in narrow shafts through the gaps, falling across a concrete floor buried beneath ash and debris. The building no longer smelled of smoke. 7 winters had carried the smoke away. All that remained was the smell of dampness, crumbling brick, and a place no one entered anymore. Maren walked directly to the wall at the far end and stopped before it, with Elias following behind her. At eye level on that wall, beneath a layer of soot that had hardened into scales, a sentence painted in large white letters was still visible, handwritten and leaning slightly to the right. No one is asked where they came from. Elias read it, and without anyone explaining, he knew what room he was standing in. Maren spoke without turning to look at him. She said she had a younger sister named Nell, and that Nell was 3 years younger than she was. She said that when Nell was 20, she worked the evening shift at a grocery store and shared an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator with 2 classmates. Then she told him about the evening she received the call. She spoke in a voice that was very even and very slow, the voice of someone who had told the story thousands of times inside her own mind, but had never once spoken it aloud to another person. She said it had been snowing that day, and the train lines were running more slowly than usual, and that she had waited 14 minutes on a station platform whose name she could still remember years later. She said that when she pushed open the glass doors of the emergency department, the hallway smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, and one of the fluorescent bulbs near the middle of the ceiling was flickering, flashing once every few seconds. She said a row of orange plastic chairs stood along the wall to the right, joined together by a metal bar, and a woman at the reception desk kept turning a stack of papers over and over, while repeatedly asking about an insurance identification number that didn't match the system. She said she could still remember the click of a ballpoint pen and the sound of its tip moving across the paper. 3 times, 4 times. At that desk, while her sister sat waiting in the second chair from the end of the row. She said she had arrived 20 minutes too late. Then she fell silent. She said nothing more about what happened afterward, and Elias didn't ask. He stood 2 steps behind her in the dusty light and couldn't say a word, because no one in his life had ever told him anything in that way before. A long time later, she continued, and her voice had changed. It was steadier now, as though she had made it through the hardest part. She said that 2 years afterward, she came to this place. People called it the threshold, not because anyone had given it that name, but because those were the only words they used when giving one another directions. Keep going until you reach that threshold. She told him about her first winter there, when she still wasn't permitted to touch anyone, and was allowed only to wash instruments and keep records. She said that during the 2nd month, the gray-haired man finally allowed her to place stitches, and her first sutures were on the arm of a middle-aged man who didn't speak English. When she finished, she thought the stitches looked good, and she raised her eyes, waiting for him to say something. He merely glanced at them and told her to remove them and begin again. She stitched the wound a 2nd time, much more carefully, and again he told her to take them out. By the 3rd attempt, her hands were trembling with anger and exhaustion, and she asked him why, in a room with only 1 lamp and 4 people waiting for their turn, it mattered whether a line of stitches looked slightly better. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said that this man didn't have a 2nd doctor to correct her work for him. Marin told Elias that it was the first lesson, and the only lesson he had ever taught her in words. She made her way around the pile of broken brick in the middle of the floor and stopped in an open space beside the eastern wall. She said that 2 tables had once stood there, and the one on the left had been his. She said there had been 4 people inside on the final night. 1 person on the table to the right had been stabilized and could walk on his own. Another couldn't. She said she had been the first to smell it. Not smoke. Before the smoke, there was always something else. A strangely sharp and sweet odor that clung to the back of the throat, and she had looked up and asked whether he noticed anything. She said he hadn't answered the question. He set the forceps down in the tray, crossed the 3 steps between them, and pushed her toward the rear metal door with 1 hand between her shoulder blades. Not hard, but continuously, never allowing her to stop or turn around. She said she had caught hold of the door frame and told him there was still someone inside who couldn't walk. He had answered her with exactly 3 sentences. Get outside. Count the pulse of the man in the driveway. Don't come back. She stopped there. The only sound inside the ruined shell was the wind passing through the gaps around the plywood covering the windows. A thin, steady, unending sound. Elias didn't ask anything. He remained where he was, more than 3 steps away, and allowed the silence to last for as long as she needed. Then she continued, her voice very soft now. She said that for years she had believed he pushed her outside because he wanted to save her, and throughout those years she had been unable to bear the thought, because if he had wanted to save her, then she had allowed him to exchange another person's life for hers, without ever asking her permission. She said it had taken her a very long time to understand that she had been wrong. He hadn't saved her. If he had wanted to save her, he would have said the things people always said in moments like that, and she wouldn't have left, because no one ever left after hearing words like those. But he hadn't done that. He had given her a task. He had issued a clinical order, clear and specific, with an identified patient and a precise instruction, exactly as he had given her orders throughout the 3 years they had spent in that room. Count the pulse of the man in the driveway. He had known it was the only thing in the world that could make her feet carry her through that door, because he was the one who had taught her that once a patient was placed in her care, there was no reason great enough to abandon that patient. She said he had used his own lesson to lead her outside. She said he hadn't saved her. He had simply given her a task, so she would have a reason to leave. Then, for the first time since they entered the building, she turned to face Elias and said that on that night, she had sat in the driveway beside the man and counted his pulse. She had kept counting until she heard the fire engines at the end of the street, because it was the task she had been given, and because she didn't know what else to do. Elias Marchetti listened to everything. He knew he had to tell her, and he knew there was no way to make the words less painful. He said that the money used for what happened that night had come from his family's accounts. He offered no further explanation. He didn't say that he still hadn't discovered who gave the order, didn't say that he himself had only just learned the truth, and didn't offer a single circumstance that might lessen his own responsibility. He spoke that one sentence, and nothing more. Marin didn't scream. She didn't step back, raise a hand to cover her face, or say a word during the stretch of time in which anyone else would have said many things. She stood there in the light filtering through the gaps in the boards, and Elias saw everything happening across her face take place behind it, with nothing allowed to reach the surface. It was a kind of composure he had never encountered in anyone during the 10 years he had occupied his position. and it frightened him more than any other reaction could have. At last, she asked him a single question. She asked how long it had taken him to find out. Ilias gave her the number. She gave one very small nod, as though recording a reading she had just seen on a monitor. Then she walked past him toward the loose board at the side of the building, pushed it aside, and stepped outside. He heard her footsteps sinking into the snow beyond the wall, then heard them grow fainter until they disappeared completely. Elias Marchetti remained alone inside the burned shell, facing the wall where 7 winters still hadn't erased the words painted in white. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know where he was supposed to go next. 3 days later, Maren Kessler received a summons from the hospital disciplinary board through the internal mail system, printed on official letterhead, with 2 lines stating that the reason was practicing beyond the authorized scope of her license on the night the Marchetti patient was admitted. The complaint was signed by head nurse Margot Ellery. She had signed it at the end of a long shift, after receiving a call from an internal extension she didn't recognize. The man on the line spoke with great courtesy and introduced himself as someone assisting the legal department. He said the hospital board had raised several concerns about the institution's legal exposure during that shift, and that if the nursing department took the initiative and filed a report first, matters would be easier for everyone. She hadn't asked for the caller's name. She hadn't called the extension back to verify who he was. She signed because it was procedure, and because for the past 2 years, she had already carried an answer in her mind to the question of what kind of person Maren Kessler was. The call had merely placed her signature in the exact space that prejudice had already prepared for it. The hearing took place in the boardroom on the 6th floor, where 7 people sat around a long table beside a window overlooking the brick wall of the neighboring building. Maren sat at the head of the table with her hands in her lap, without an attorney or anyone beside her. The charge was read aloud. She was asked whether she wished to make a statement. She said that she had documented everything she had done in the patient's record that same night, and had nothing to add. That was all she said during the hearing. Then the door opened, and resident physician Fallon Reyes entered. She apologized for being late, pulled out a chair, sat down, and placed a laptop and a thick file on the table. She opened the recording from the inter-hospital coordination system that night, moved to the relevant section, and the entire room listened in silence as Maren recited her employee identification number. They heard her say that if a signature was required, the record should state that she had made the decision on her own authority. They heard the coordinator on the other end ask a question, then say that someone would call her back. Fallon allowed the recording to continue for another 10 seconds, until the sound of an alarm could be heard in the background, then stopped it. Afterward, she opened the file and said that she had spent 2 weeks on her own, gathering all the data from Nurse Kessler's night shifts during the 2 years she had worked in the department, 214 shifts. She read the percentage of patients transferred to intensive care in stable condition, and compared it with the department average during the same period. She read the number of times Maren had been the first to recognize signs of deterioration before the machine sounded an alarm. She read every figure slowly, without adding a word of commentary. And when she finished, she closed the file and said that if the board still intended to take disciplinary action, she wanted her name entered into the official record as an objecting party. The hearing ended without a decision that day. Margot Ellery rose before everyone had left, walked into the hallway, and waited beside the window. When Maren emerged, Margot called her back. She used her name, not her title. And it was the first time in 2 years she had done so. She didn't apologize. She said that once, while standing in the break room, she had told someone that Maren worked like a machine plugged into an electrical outlet and was every bit as warm. She spoke in the voice of someone reading aloud from a sheet of paper she had just discovered in a drawer, offering no defense and making no claim that she had changed her mind. Maren studied her for a moment, then said she knew. When Margot had spoken those words, Maren had been standing exactly 2 meters away on the other side of the supply rack. Margot Ellery had no answer. Maren gave her a small nod and walked toward the elevator, while the head nurse remained alone beside the window, looking down at the parking lot below, with the sudden and unmistakable realization that the call that day had reached exactly the right person. Hollis brought him 4 sheets of paper late one afternoon, and he said nothing as he placed them on the desk. He simply waited by the door until Elias looked up, then walked out. 4 petitions, sent to 4 different agencies over the course of 7 years, each submitted roughly 18 months to 2 years after the one before it. All were typed. All were brief. All followed the formal structure that someone without an attorney might teach herself by studying publicly available templates online. The first had been sent to the City Fire Investigation Office. The second had gone to the department's internal affairs division. The third had been sent to the county prosecutor's office. The fourth had gone to a non-profit organization that reviewed cases whose files had been closed. All four had received printed form letters in reply. And in every petition, in the section listing the leads, the writer asked investigators to examine. There was an identical line, carefully worded, making no accusation and requesting only that the information be compared. That line contained his family name. Elias read the final petition again and again. It had been sent nearly 2 years earlier, around the time its author began working night shifts at St. Brendan's Mercy. He folded all 4 sheets, took them with him, and drove to the hospital. She was in the emergency stairwell, sitting on the 4th step from the top, but this time there was no food container on her knees. She saw the papers in his hand and immediately understood what they were. He held them out without speaking. She took them, turned through each sheet, then handed them back and said that since he had already read them, he probably didn't need her to confirm anything else. In a voice even lower than usual, he asked whether she had known who he was from the very first night. Marin didn't evade the question for even a second. She said the patient classification sheet had been printed and posted at the intake desk before the gurney reached the doors. That was procedure. She had been the one to read it, and she had seen the family name. Elias asked when. She said about 10 seconds before the automatic doors opened. He stood motionless. Then he asked what happened after that. She answered that she did her job. She didn't raise her voice or emphasize a single word. She spoke exactly as someone would answer a question whose answer was too obvious to deserve being asked. Elias said she had 10 seconds, and there were many things she could have done in those 10 seconds. She could have slowed down by a single beat. She could have allowed the 2 residents to step ahead of her. She could have remained precisely where she belonged and done only the part of the work no one could ever have faulted her for doing, and no one in the world would have known what she had thought during those 10 seconds, not even she herself. Marin listened to everything. Then she said he was telling her the very things she had thought during those 10 seconds, and she had no intention of pretending she hadn't thought them. She said she had. During those 10 seconds, she had seen the family name on the paper with perfect clarity, and she had also seen a wall bearing words painted in white, and both things had existed beside each other in her mind at the same time. Then, in the same steady voice, she said that if she had allowed his brother to die that night, she would have been the one who burned down the clinic, not the man standing across the street, not the person who paid for it. Her, because the clinic had never been a building. It was a single sentence written on a wall, and that sentence existed only as long as someone continued to live by it. She said her teacher had preserved that sentence by turning back into a place he knew perfectly well he would never leave alive. She had only been asked to preserve it for 10 seconds, with her own 2 hands, before a young man of 22 who had nothing to do with any of it. She said that if she couldn't do the far easier part, then everything her teacher had done on his final night would become meaningless, and she would be the one who made it meaningless. Elias Marchetti couldn't speak. During the 10 years he had occupied his position, people had knelt before him, people had lied to him with extraordinary skill, and people had offered him more money than he needed. Not once had any of those things made him search for something to lean against. He looked at the woman sitting on the step before him, the woman who had spent 7 years knocking on the doors of 4 agencies to uncover his name, who had held that name in her hands on the very night the man carrying it lay motionless on a gurney, and who had chosen to use those 10 seconds to retrieve the instrument kit. He understood that she didn't forgive him. She had never spoken a single word about forgiveness. She had simply refused to carry any of it into the emergency room, and that was something entirely different, something he had no right whatsoever to receive. His legs lost their strength before he realized what was happening, and he sat down on the concrete step where he stood, one hand braced against his knee, his head lowered. Marin said nothing. She didn't rise and walk away either. They remained there in the stairwell for a long time, each seated on a different step, neither looking at the other, while the ventilation system hummed steadily around them. The woman in the gray wool coat waited for her in the employee dining room midway through the shift. Seated at the table beside the window, with both hands resting around an untouched cup of tea. She had been there for nearly 40 minutes before Marin Kessler walked in. She didn't stand. She merely pushed out the chair across from her with the toe of her shoe and said she needed only 15 minutes. Marin looked at the identification card lying face up on the table, read the name Dara Whitfield printed on it, then pulled out the chair and sat down, still holding her own cup of coffee. Whitfield didn't waste time. She said she had followed a collection of files bearing the Marchetti name for many years, long enough to know what was in them and what had never been allowed to enter them. Then she opened the leather briefcase at her feet, removed a stack of photographs, and began laying them on the table one at a time, saying nothing as she did. The photographs formed 2 rows. A man emerging from the rear door of a warehouse in the Harbor District before dawn. The same man, younger, standing beside a truck in a container yard, speaking to someone whose face had been blurred. A photograph taken from a distance through the window of a restaurant. Another taken at a funeral, showing rows of people dressed in black, with him standing in the front row at the age of 24, wearing the face of a man who had already made a decision. Another showed him entering an office building with 2 men whom Whitfield identified by name, along with the sentences both men had received. She placed the final photograph on the table, then said these were the ones she was permitted to show Marin, and that the part she wasn't allowed to reveal was much thicker. She asked whether Marin knew whom she was standing beside. Marin didn't push any of the photographs away. She set down her coffee, drew the pictures closer, and examined them from the first to the last, lifting each one between 2 fingers exactly as she handled medical images on a lightbox. She moved no faster and no slower over any of them, not even the photograph from the funeral. Whitfield watched her and didn't hurry her. When Marin finished, she arranged the photographs into a neat stack, pushed them back across the table, and said that Whitfield was showing her what the man had done over the course of 10 years, and that she wasn't disputing a single photograph. She said that where she worked, people were wheeled through the doors every night, and if someone had photographed them over the previous 10 years, the resulting stacks probably wouldn't be any thinner than this one. She said she had never been permitted to see those photographs before placing her hands on them, and she believed that was precisely why people still dared to enter a hospital. Then she spoke her final sentence very quietly. Whitfield was asking whether she knew who he was, but her work had never allowed her to ask that question. Dara Whitfield remained silent for a long time after that. She looked down at the stack of photographs, then out the window, and only then did she reach for them and return them to her briefcase. Before standing, she said she hadn't come there to tell Marin what to think. She had come to make sure Marin knew that people were watching, and that when everything broke open, it wouldn't ask where anyone had been standing. She left a business card on the table. This time, it was picked up. That same afternoon, on the other side of the city, Barrett Quinn received a brief call from an old acquaintance who worked in the county social services office. The acquaintance said that 2 people had recently come asking about the residency records of a shelter in back of the yards. They had asked very specific questions about a period during the winter 7 years earlier, and one of them had presented old department credentials. Barrett thanked the caller, hung up, and remained motionless at his desk for a long time. He didn't need to ask anything more. Only one sentence repeated itself in his mind, again and again. The scene examination report that day had recorded 1 person, and in 7 years, he had never once considered the possibility that the number was wrong. What kept Marin awake after that day wasn't the photographs. It was a number. The scene examination report recorded 1 person, but there had been 4 people inside the building that night. 2 had walked out on their own, and she had been the 3rd. The 4th was the man who couldn't walk, the man she had told the doctor couldn't yet be moved, and he had never appeared by name in any document in the city. For 7 years, she had believed that he had remained inside as well, and that there had simply been nothing left to find. Now, sitting before the photocopied page Hollis Barrow had given her, she reread the line stating that only 1 body had been recovered, and she understood that for 7 years, she had accepted a number she should have counted again. She remembered the man's name because she had been the one keeping the records during the week he was brought in, and she remembered that he had lain there for 7 weeks with a fractured pelvis, supported by 2 mattresses stacked in the farthest corner, unable to walk or turn himself over. Hollis needed another 4 days. He took a roundabout path through the shelters, never asking directly for anyone by name, only asking about long-term residents, people without complete documentation, and those whom social workers described as stable long-term cases. At the 5th shelter, in back of the yards, a woman working the afternoon shift looked at the name written on the paper and nodded. Cyrus Bell lived in a small room at the end of the 1st-floor hallway, with 1 window facing the brick wall of the neighboring warehouse and an armchair positioned directly beside it. He was 63, gaunt, with closely cropped hair, and he walked with a cane. When Marin entered the room, he was sitting in that chair, and he recognized her immediately, before she could even say her name. He didn't stand. He merely looked at her for a very long time, then said, "I've waited 7 years for someone to walk through this door, and I still don't know whether I should be relieved or afraid." He invited them to sit on the edge of the bed, because there was only 1 chair in the room. Then he began to tell them what happened. He spoke slowly, occasionally pausing for a long time, and neither of them hurried him. He said that on that night, He had been lying in the far corner, fully conscious. He had heard Marin ask the doctor whether he smelled anything. He had heard footsteps, then the rear metal door opening and closing. Immediately afterward, the doctor had returned to him. Cyrus said there had been a long wooden board in the corner that he used to support his back whenever he sat upright. The doctor had pulled it out, rolled Cyrus onto it, then dragged the entire board across the concrete floor toward the rear door. Cyrus Bell said he could still remember the sound of the wood scraping over the cement, a long, jarring, broken sound, and he remembered that the man pulling the board had already been in his 60s. Once they were outside, the doctor dragged him farther, all the way to the edge of the driveway, then bent down and asked him one question. He asked whether Cyrus was certain he was the only person still inside. Cyrus said he hadn't been able to answer. He didn't know. He had spent the entire evening lying in the corner and hadn't been able to see everything, so he had told the truth. He wasn't sure. Then the other man had nodded, stood, thrown a box toward him, turned around, and gone back inside. Cyrus Bell stopped there for a very long time. Then he said that for 7 years, he had thought about only those 3 words. I wasn't sure. If he had said he was the only one left inside, perhaps everything would have been different. He told the final part more quickly, as though he wanted to get it over with. He said he had been lying in the driveway with his face turned toward the street, and from there he could see the entire sidewalk across the road. A man had been standing there, upright, making no attempt to hide, not pacing, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, beneath the second streetlight from the corner. Cyrus had waited for the man to run and call someone. He had waited for him to cross the street. He had waited a very long time. The man did nothing. He remained in the same place until the roof above collapsed, and only after everything had fallen did he remove his hands from his pockets, turn around, and walk toward the end of the street. Cyrus said he hadn't seen the man's face clearly because of the distance and the poor light, but he remembered the way the man stood, and he remembered how slowly he removed his hands from his pockets, before turning away, like someone who had just finished watching something for which he bore a measure of responsibility. He said that seeing that was why he hadn't dared to speak for 7 years. Then he pushed himself upright with his cane, walked to the wooden cabinet at the foot of the bed, opened the lowest door, and pulled out a dented gray cardboard box with tape across 2 corners and a thin layer of dust over its surface. He placed it on Marin Kessler's lap with both hands, held it there for another second, then released it and said, "I've never opened it." Marin rested both hands on the lid of the box without opening it, and she immediately noticed that something was wrong. The dust across its surface wasn't even. In the upper right corner was a cleaner rectangular patch about the size of a hand, the kind of mark left only when something had recently been removed. She looked up at Cyrus Bell. He was staring at the floor. She reminded him that he had just said he had never opened the box. Cyrus didn't answer at once. Leaning on his cane, he returned to the chair beside the window, lowered himself into it very slowly, and said he had told her one lie, and only one. He had opened the box exactly once, about a month earlier. At the beginning of that winter, the neighborhood health clinic had offered free screenings to the shelter's long-term residents, and they had taken an X-ray of his lungs. He said the young doctor had sat with him for a long time before speaking, and when she finally did, she chose her words with great care. But he had lived long enough to understand what people were unwilling to say plainly. He said that when he returned to his room that night, he sat in the chair beside the window, and for the first time in 7 years, he thought that if he carried the box into the grave with him, everything inside it would end forever, and the man who had dragged him out of that building would remain nothing more than an incorrect line in a file no one would ever open again. He said he opened the box that night. He didn't read everything. He didn't dare read everything. He turned through only the first few pages, saw the names, and recognized a family name known throughout the city. He sat all night with the papers in his lap, and the next morning, he did something he had considered over and over. He removed exactly 1 page. He took it to the copy shop on the corner, made a photocopy, returned the original to its place, then put the copy into a white envelope. He wrote nothing on it. No sender's name, no address, not a single line of explanation. He said he had done that deliberately. He didn't want money. He didn't want to negotiate. He only wanted to see what the man would do when he held the page in his hands, because he had told himself that if a man was truly guilty, he would make a move, and an old man of 63 with little time remaining had nothing left to lose. He said he had placed the envelope in the mailbox on the corner with his own hands 3 weeks earlier. Hollis Barrow stood with his back against the wall, and Marin saw him close his eyes for 1 second. She understood before Cyrus did. She was about to say something, But the old man had already raised his head and looked at her, and a question was slowly taking shape across his face. He asked whether something had happened afterward. No one in the room answered immediately, and the silence answered for them. He looked from Marin to Hollis and then back to her before asking a second time, his voice different now. Marin told him the truth as briefly as she could. The previous week, a vehicle had gone through the guardrail of a bridge, and the person inside had been the younger brother of the man who received the envelope, a student of 22, who had nothing to do with any of it. Cyrus Bell couldn't speak. The cane slipped from his hand and fell against the leg of the chair. He raised both hands to cover his face, and his entire body folded forward as though someone had drawn all the air from his chest. During that time, he made no sound, not a single sound, and that was what made it hardest to witness. Marin Kessler rose, crossed the 3 steps between them, and sat on the floor directly before his chair, level with him, in exactly the position she used when speaking to a frightened patient. She drew his hands away from his face and held them in her own. His hands were cold and trembling violently. She told him that she understood what was happening inside his mind because she had lived with the same thing for many years. She had counted every minute of a stretch of time in which she had arrived too late, counting it over and over until the number became something she carried with her everywhere. She said it had taken her a very long time to understand that some consequences arose from the things we did, but the blame didn't belong to us. He had placed a sheet of paper in a mailbox. Someone else had tampered with that vehicle, and that person had a name, and she promised him that the name would be spoken aloud. She told him that what happened wasn't his fault, and that he needed to hear those words from someone else, instead of saying them to himself, because saying them to yourself was never enough. It had taken her 7 years to learn that. Barrett Quinn had few choices left, and he understood that better than anyone. The box had left the room in back of the yards. The man who had lain in the driveway that night had begun to speak, and somewhere in the city, a woman in a gray wool coat was waiting for exactly one telephone call. He couldn't recover the box. He couldn't silence an old man now being watched by 2 people. But there was still one thing he could take, and it was the only thing in the world capable of making Elias Marchetti lose the ability to think in straight lines. His plan didn't require darkness. It required paperwork. That night, a real ambulance bearing the markings of a real private medical transportation company legally operating in the state stopped at the eastern receiving entrance of St. Brendan's Mercy. 2 men stepped out wearing genuine uniforms and genuine employee identification cards, pushing a regulation transfer gurney equipped with oxygen tanks and infusion pumps. They went directly to the night desk of the intensive care unit on the 5th floor, offered a polite greeting, and placed a transfer file on the counter. The transfer order had been typed on the proper form. It included the receiving hospital code, the name of a real rehabilitation facility on the north side of the city, the electronic signature of a coordinating physician, and even a hotline number for verification. The number was real, and a real person would answer it. The night nurse reviewed the file, found nothing unusual, and opened the software to begin preparing the handoff. Marin Kessler passed the desk at that exact moment, returning from the supply room with an instrument tray in her hands, and she glanced down at the counter with the habit of anyone who had worked nights long enough. She walked 3 more steps, then stopped. She returned to the desk, set down the tray, and asked to examine the first page again. The nurse slid it toward her. Marin read it from top to bottom, slowly, 1 line at a time, until her eyes stopped at a small box in the upper right corner. The box no one had noticed, because it contained only 2 characters. The blood type listed on the transfer order was a positive. She had personally called Inter-Hospital Coordination on that first night to request blood for this patient. She had spoken his blood type aloud over the telephone. She had signed for every unit when it was delivered. Milo Marchetti's blood type was O negative, and she would remember that for the rest of her life. Marin placed the page on the counter, and in the span of a single breath, she considered every remaining possibility. A typing error could occur in any other box, in the address, the room number, or the date, but not in this one. This was the box every system in the world checked twice, because this was the box that could kill someone. No medical transportation service recorded the wrong blood type on a transfer order unless the person completing that form had never intended to deliver the patient to any hospital at all, and the box had therefore meant nothing more to them than an empty space that needed to be filled. She looked up. The 2 men were still standing across the counter, calm and composed. One was checking his watch. The other was tapping his fingers against the side of the gurney in a steady rhythm. They weren't in a hurry. They had no reason to be. The night nurse had finished opening the software and was entering the patient code into the search field. Marin looked down the corridor behind her. The physician covering the night shift was on the third floor attending to another case. Fallon Reyes had gone off duty that afternoon. Security was stationed in the main lobby 4 floors below, and even if Marin pressed the call button, it would take several minutes for anyone to arrive. During those minutes, she would have to explain to someone that 2 characters were wrong in a box on an otherwise perfectly valid document, while the 2 men stood there listening to every word. She had less than 2 minutes, and she understood that the only thing capable of stopping a flawless set of documents wasn't a nurse's suspicion, but a name with enough authority to say no. She turned her head once more. At the far end of the corridor, beneath the dim night lights, a woman had just emerged from the break room with a cup of tea in one hand and her coat draped over her arm, preparing to leave after a long shift. She was the head nurse of the department. She was the woman who had signed the disciplinary complaint against Marin exactly 8 days earlier, and in the entire building, at that precise moment, she was the only person who could help her. Marin walked down the corridor at a normal pace, not taking a single step faster, because she knew the 2 men were watching her back. She stopped in front of Margot Ellery, and in the time it took to speak 3 sentences, she told her 3 things. The blood type on the transfer order was A positive, the patient was O negative, and Marin had personally verified every unit of blood. She needed someone with the authority to stop the transfer immediately. Margot Ellery didn't ask a single question. She had been a nurse for 27 years, and she understood at once what an error in that particular box meant. Perhaps she also understood that this was the one chance in her life to choose differently. She placed her tea on the windowsill, left her coat draped over her arm, and walked to the alarm box mounted on the wall at the end of the corridor. Then she activated the full unit lockdown procedure. It was exactly what Marin had anticipated, and it was the only move that made sense, because the 2 men had come to remove a patient quietly and lawfully, without anyone remembering their faces, and what they needed more than anything at that moment was silence. She didn't give them silence. She gave them everything that was its opposite. The alarm began sounding in short, steady bursts, repeating along the entire ceiling of the corridor. Emergency lights mounted at the corners of the walls came alive and sent red beams sweeping in circles. A moment later, the entire backup lighting system switched to full power, flooding the 5th floor with light as bright as day. The magnetic doors at both ends of the unit closed with a sharp, clean metallic click. The elevator system automatically returned every car to the ground floor and locked them there. On the control panel in the security office below the lobby, a red square appeared with the floor number, and every camera in that area was transferred to the main screen. The 2 men at the desk turned their heads at almost the same moment. In less than a minute, a corridor that had contained only 3 people now held nearly 30. Nurses emerged from patient rooms, technicians appeared, family members sleeping in chairs jolted awake, and 2 physicians on duty ran up the stairs from the floor below. Everyone was looking toward the sound of the alarm. Fallon Reyes, who had received Marin's call while driving home and turned her car around half an hour earlier, stood at the western stairwell with her back holding open the fire door. She blocked the only remaining exit in the simplest possible way, standing there with a clipboard in her hand and loudly asking whether anyone needed assistance. Margot Ellery picked up the security radio and spoke a single sentence into it. She reported a suspected loss of control over supplies in the sterile area on the 5th floor and requested that the entire security team respond. Then she entered the access code for the sterile section, sealing the final passage into the eastern wing. It wasn't true. She knew it wasn't true when she said it, and she knew that if everything went wrong, those words would end her 27-year career. She said them anyway. Marin Kessler stood several steps away and heard every word, and she understood that this was the apology, because some people could go their entire lives without being able to say those 3 words aloud and could only express them by doing something they had no obligation to do. In the basement parking garage, Elias Marchetti and Hollis Barrow stepped out of the car when the alarm began echoing down through the ventilation shafts. The elevators were locked. They took the stairs up 5 floors, with Elias leading the way. Barrett Quinn hadn't been in the corridor when the alarm sounded. He had been in the rear service area, where he intended to leave with the gurney through the linen transport passage. When the magnetic door closed, he turned back and moved along the narrow corridor connecting the 2 wings of the 5th floor, a passage barely wide enough for a supply cart, with a low ceiling and emergency lights mounted directly overhead. Elias met him in the middle of it. Neither man spoke. The red light swept across their faces in repeating circles, bright and then dark, bright and then dark, while the alarm continued its steady rhythm above them. Barrett stepped back half a pace, then lunged forward in an attempt to get past. In a space barely as wide as two men standing shoulder to shoulder, they collided and both staggered. The corridor had been mopped less than 10 minutes earlier, and the yellow wet floor sign was still standing at the far end, about 10 feet away. Barrett's foot slipped. He fell sideways, struck his left shoulder against the edge of the metal doorframe leading into the equipment room, and slid to the floor. The impact was brief, almost swallowed by the alarm. Hollis reached them 2 seconds later. Barrett Quinn lay on the floor with his back against the base of the wall, his left arm hanging at an angle that anyone who had ever worked in a hospital would have recognized from the far end of the corridor. He drew breath in short, ragged gasps, his face deathly pale beneath the red light sweeping back and forth. He didn't rise again. He looked up at Elias, and there was none of the politeness left in his eyes that had belonged to the man who had poured coffee for him for 11 years. Marin Kessler entered the narrow corridor, carrying a thin blanket and a triangular bandage taken from the emergency cart, and she didn't stop when she saw who was lying on the floor. She knelt beside Barrett Quinn, placed 2 fingers against his wrist to check his pulse before doing anything else, then spoke to him in the same voice she used with every patient in the building. She told him that she was going to immobilize his arm, that it would hurt when she lifted it, and that he should breathe out when she counted to 3. He stared at her without understanding. She folded the blanket into a thick pad and slid it between his arm and his body to hold the shoulder joint at its current angle. Then she looped the triangular bandage around his neck and tied the knot to one side so it wouldn't press against his spine. She worked slowly and steadily, without wasting a single movement, beneath the red light that continued sweeping across the walls in even circles. Elias Marchetti stood there and watched. At last, he asked what she was doing. He asked very quietly, not because he wanted to stop her, but because he truly couldn't understand what he was seeing. She didn't look up. She continued adjusting the knot, and said that where she used to work, no one was asked where they came from. She spoke the sentence as though reading a line from a handbook, without emphasis and without looking at anyone. Then she told the nurse who had just arrived to call the orthopedic trauma unit and prepare imaging of the left shoulder. Barrett Quinn lay motionless on the floor, drawing one short breath after another, and throughout that time, he never took his eyes from her face. As they wheeled him away, he said something very softly, but the alarm was still sounding and no one heard him, not even her. Elias reached home in the deepest part of the night. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He went directly to his study, opened the wall safe behind the bookcase, and removed a leather-bound ledger worn at all 4 corners. It wasn't an accounting book. There were no numbers inside. There were only names, handwritten one to a line, with a date beside each one. He had begun keeping the ledger at the age of 24, during the week after his father's funeral, and he had written in it for 10 years, with the absolute conviction that every new line represented another part of the debt repaid. He sat at the desk, switched on the lamp, and began reading from the beginning. He read slowly. He didn't skim. He read every name, and at each one, he paused long enough to remember the face that belonged to it, the voice, the room, and every reason he had considered beyond dispute 10 years earlier. When he reached the 11th line, he stopped. The name belonged to a man he had never met before or after that night, a man who appeared on the list only because of 2 witness statements and an old business connection, a man who had told Elias that he didn't understand what was happening, and Elias had believed that was what anyone in his position would say. He stared at the name for a very long time. He didn't turn to the next page. He didn't close the ledger. He simply sat there with both hands resting on either side of it while the desk lamp shone down upon the paper, and in the vast house, there wasn't a sound except the heating system running inside the walls. He thought about a woman who, only hours earlier, had knelt on a corridor floor to bind the arm of the man who had taken her teacher from her, and he understood that the distance between himself and that woman wasn't the distance between a bad person and a good one. It was the distance between a man who had spent 10 years believing he had the right to classify human beings, and a woman who had never allowed herself to do so, not even once during 10 seconds. He still possessed everything he had always possessed. He had people willing to answer their phones at any hour. He had places in the city where no one asked questions. He had a bridge, and beneath that bridge flowed a river that had taken many things over the years, and had never returned any of them. With Barrett Quinn lying in a hospital room and one of Elias's men stationed outside the door, everything could be over before dawn, cleanly, and no one in the city would be surprised. Elias Marchetti remained seated for a little while longer. Then he closed the ledger, placed it in the center of the desk, and removed from the drawer the business card he had refused to accept in the parking garage that night, the card he had later picked up from the table in the hospital employee dining room. He looked at the name printed on it. Then he picked up the telephone and dialed the number. Dara Whitfield arrived before dawn, alone and without an escort vehicle, and she sat across from Elias Marchetti in that study for nearly 3 hours. He gave her the gray cardboard box that an old man in back of the yards had kept inside a wooden cabinet for 7 years. He gave her the organization's complete financial records from the previous 11 years, every original volume, with nothing missing, including the page showing the payment to a demolition contractor, with the box identifying the person who requested it left blank. He also gave her the leather-bound ledger worn at all 4 corners, something she hadn't requested and hadn't known existed. Whitfield opened it, read the first few lines, then looked up at him for a very long time and asked whether he understood what he had just placed on the table. Elias said he did. He asked for nothing. He proposed no agreement, didn't ask about leniency, and made no mention of becoming a witness. He said only that he wanted the name of the gray-haired man entered into an official record, and that was the one thing he requested. Over the next 6 weeks, the 3 container ports bearing his family name were sealed. Both transportation companies ceased operating, and the accounts were frozen in stages. People called him less and less often, until eventually the calls stopped altogether. Hollis Barrow didn't wait for anyone to come looking for him. One morning, he went to the federal office on his own, carrying a printed copy of the photograph showing the scene report with his own signature beneath the conclusion. He placed it on the table and spent the entire day giving a statement about everything he had known and everything he hadn't known when he put pen to paper. Milo Marchetti was weaned from the ventilator during the week after the lockdown and regained full consciousness 3 days later. He had lost a great deal of weight. His voice was painfully hoarse, and it took nearly a week before he could speak in complete sentences. Elias was the one who told him everything. Sitting in the plastic chair beside the bed, he left nothing out. He told him about their father, about the 10 years, and about the vehicle Milo had borrowed that night. Milo listened from beginning to end, without interrupting once. When Elias finished, the room remained silent for a very long time. Milo didn't say that he forgave him. He didn't say that everything was all right. He stared at the ceiling for a while, then turned his head and told his brother, "I don't need you to be blameless. I just need you to stay." Elias Marchetti lowered his head against the edge of the hospital bed and remained that way for a long time. Milo placed the hand that still held an intravenous line against the back of his neck and kept it there without saying anything more. The first hearing opened near the end of winter in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the federal building, with tall windows, molded ceilings, and outdoor light falling in square blocks across the wooden floor. Maren Kessler was called as a witness. She wore the only decent coat she owned, and her hair was tied low as it was every day. She was asked about the period when she had worked at the address on the west side of the city, and she answered. She was asked about the person in charge of that place, and requested to provide his full name for the record. Maren remained silent for about 2 seconds. For 7 years, she had never spoken that name aloud anywhere. She hadn't said it to her colleagues. She hadn't written it in any of the 4 petitions she had sent. She hadn't even spoken it to herself in the changing room on the nights she opened the tin box. Then she said it. She said his name was Ezra Lund. She spelled every letter for the court clerk, slowly and clearly, and she heard the keyboard recording them one by one. 6 letters, then 4 letters. 7 years after that night, his name finally had a line in the city's official record, written correctly, preserved, and beyond anyone's power to erase. In the final row of the courtroom, an old man sat with his back straight and his cane propped beside his knee. He wore a white shirt, still marked by the folds from its packaging, a shirt someone had bought for him the week before. When the name was spoken aloud, Cyrus Bell quickly raised one hand and wiped his face with the back of it, and no one sitting beside him said a word. They paused on the stone steps outside the federal building when the hearing ended, while the March wind moved along the street, carrying the last chill of winter, a cold that had lost its sharpest edge and had begun to smell of damp earth and things preparing to grow. People descended the steps around them, attorneys carrying briefcases, reporters packing away their equipment, and those who had been sitting in the courtroom returning to ordinary people hurrying home. Elias Marchetti stood beside Maren Kessler, and for a long time, he said nothing. Then he said, "I don't have anything left to give you." He spoke very calmly, not as a lament, but as a man accurately stating the condition in which he now found himself. Maren looked toward the street below, where cars moved slowly through puddles of melted snow. She said, "I never asked what you had." Then she reached her right hand toward her left wrist, and instead of pulling down her sleeve with the reflex she had repeated thousands of times over 7 years, she drew it upward. She left it there. The small tattoo lay exposed beneath the March sunlight, a circle open at the top with a straight line passing through it, and she no longer tried to hide it. Elias looked down at her wrist, then raised his eyes to her face, and said nothing more. Together, they descended the remaining steps. Several months later, on a morning near the end of summer, a red brick building on the west side of the city opened its doors for the first time. It had been rebuilt on the original foundation, preserving the shape of the large rolling door at the front, and beside the main entrance hung a small bronze plaque engraved with the words, Lund Community Clinic. Beneath the name, another line stated that the clinic was open around the clock. Elias Marchetti now had only one legally operating transportation company, with 9 trucks, and most of what the company earned was used to pay the salaries of the clinic's 14 employees. His name appeared on no sign, wasn't included on the list of donors posted in the lobby, and wasn't mentioned in any speech. That was the only condition he had imposed when he signed the papers, and no one argued with him. The morning of the opening was bright and clear, and a large crowd gathered. Neighbors from the surrounding community, social workers, and several elderly women who brought homemade cakes and placed them on the long table in the courtyard. Milo Marchetti walked to the front with the help of a cane, and instead of an ordinary ceremonial ribbon, he cut through the elevation drawing of the building, a design he had created himself during the months of his recovery. The applause continued for a very long time. A young boy slipped through the crowd, his left arm free of the cast that had been removed in the spring, and Sammy Hargrove stopped in front of Maren Kessler. He dug a new turtle sticker from his pocket, yellow this time, and pressed it onto her new name badge. He placed it just as crooked as before. His mother stood behind him laughing, and Maren bent down until her eyes were level with his and said, "It looks as though this turtle has finally found exactly where it belongs." She left the sticker there. She always did. Inside the lobby, on the wall opposite the entrance, a sentence had been painted in large white letters, handwritten and leaning slightly to the right, every stroke copied precisely from an old photograph. No one is asked where they came from. Some things in life aren't saved by power, aren't saved by money, and aren't saved by grand promises. They're saved only by people who choose to remain a little longer when they could easily turn their backs and walk away. A line of stitches redone for the 3rd time. A pair of hands that never left a stranger's chest. A single lie told by a woman who hadn't lied in 27 years. And no one in this world deserves to be defined forever by the worst night of their life, because we aren't the worst thing we have done. We are the kindest thing we still dare to do afterward. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the person you're thinking of, so that each day you'll have more meaningful stories to hear. How did today's story make you feel? And if you had been in Maren's place, what would you have done during those 10 seconds? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health and a life filled with happiness and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.